When my instincts speak, I've learned to stop everything and listen. I didn't always do that. There was a time I second-guessed myself, told myself I was being old-fashioned, overprotective, too suspicious of people who hadn't done anything wrong yet. That version of me cost me a great deal, not in money, though there was money involved, but in something harder to replace: trust, peace, the kind of sleep where you don't wake up at 3 in the morning running numbers in your head. I'm 67 years old. I've been a widow for 11 years. I raised my daughter mostly alone after her father passed, and I did it the way my own mother raised me, quietly, carefully, always thinking 3 steps ahead. We weren't a family that talked about money at the dinner table. We didn't announce what we had or what we were worth. My mother used to say, "The mouth is the most expensive organ in the body." I didn't understand that when I was young. I understand it completely now. My daughter's 34. She's smart, kind, and trusts people far more easily than I do. I used to think that was a flaw. I've come to understand it's just who she is. Her father was the same way, and it was one of the things I loved most about him. The world hadn't hardened her the way it hardened me, and for a long time I was grateful for that. Then she told me she was getting married. I want to be clear, I liked him, her husband, I mean. Still do, in many ways. He's decent, works hard, genuinely loves her. I could see that plainly. What I couldn't see clearly at first was his mother. She came into our lives warm and laughing, always bringing something: a casserole, a bottle of wine, a story about her son's childhood that made everyone at the table smile. She had this way of making herself seem indispensable very quickly. Within 6 months of my daughter bringing him home, his mother was calling my daughter, my other daughter, leaving voice messages just to say she was thinking of her. It was a lot. Too much, too fast, but my daughter was glowing, and I didn't want to be the person who dimmed that. So I watched. I listened. I filed things away. The first thing that made me uncomfortable was small. We were planning a family dinner. His parents, me, the 2 of them. His mother called me directly. Not my daughter, not her son, but me, to discuss the restaurant. That shouldn't have been a big thing. But something in the way she spoke to me felt like she was taking inventory. She asked questions that went just a little bit past friendly. How long had I lived in my house? Whether I still worked or was fully retired? What neighborhood I was in? She dressed it up in pleasantry, but I'd been in enough rooms with enough people to recognize when someone is appraising you. I gave her very little. I smiled through the phone, answered vaguely, redirected. She didn't seem frustrated by that, and that, oddly, made me more alert. People who are just making conversation get a little thrown when you deflect. People who are gathering information just pivot and try a different angle. She pivoted, tried a different angle. I didn't say anything to my daughter then. She was happy. The engagement had just happened. The ring was beautiful. The proposal had been everything she'd dreamed of, and I was not going to walk into that joy with suspicion I couldn't yet prove. But I called my attorney. I've worked with the same attorney for almost 20 years. She's handled my estate planning, my late husband's affairs, the trust I set up for my daughter when she turned 25. I called her and I said, I need everything airtight. I need to understand exactly what my daughter's exposure would be if this marriage went sideways, and I need to know what we can do now, quietly, before any of this becomes a problem. We spent 2 months getting things in order. Updated documents, clear structures, protections that didn't require my daughter to do anything differently. She just had to not volunteer information. That part was up to me to handle. I waited for the right moment to talk to her. It came about 3 weeks before the wedding. We were sitting in my kitchen, just the 2 of us, the way it had been for so many years, and she was going over the seating chart, and she was tired and a little overwhelmed, and she looked up at me and said, I just want it to be over so we can be married and everything can calm down. I put my hand over hers and I said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me all the way through before you respond. She set down her pen. I told her everything. Not vaguely, everything. Not vaguely. Everything. The phone call that had felt like an appraisal. The pivot when I deflected. The way his mother had started referring to our family in ways that seemed to include my assets in the circumference of that word. I told her about the 2 months I'd spent with my attorney. I told her that I loved her, and I loved him, and I was not asking her to distrust her future husband, but that I needed her to understand one thing clearly and to keep it. Do not tell his mother anything about what I have, I said. Not the house, not the trust, not the investment accounts. Nothing. Not because you should be ashamed of it, but because not everyone who smiles at you wants good things for you. And I've seen enough of the world to know the difference. My daughter was quiet for a long time. I could see she was working through it, the conflict between what she felt about her future mother-in-law and what I was telling her. She wasn't angry, she was careful, the way she gets when something matters. Finally, she said, "Do you think she's dangerous?" I said, "I think she's motivated. And motivated people who don't get what they want can become dangerous very quickly." She nodded slowly. She folded the seating chart in half. She said, "Okay, that was it. Just, okay." I've never been more proud of her in my life. The wedding was beautiful. I cried twice. Once when she walked out and I saw her face, and once during the vows when her husband's voice broke and he had to stop and breathe before he could finish. Whatever else was complicated about that family, what he felt for my daughter in that moment was real. I held on to that. The reception was warm and full and loud in the best way. His mother hugged me at the end of the night and said she was so happy our families were joined. I hugged her back and smiled and said all the right things. I am very good at saying all the right things. I am very good at saying all the right things when I need to. They left for their honeymoon the next morning. 4 days later, my daughter called me. They were back early, not because anything had gone wrong between them, but because his mother had been calling her husband repeatedly, leaving messages that started as just checking in and escalated into something that required them to come home and deal with it. My daughter's voice was controlled, but then, the way it gets when she's managing something difficult. She said, she wants to meet. She says it's about family financial planning. She wants the 4 of us to sit down together. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Does she have any paperwork?" A pause. She mentioned something about documents. There it was. "Don't meet with her yet," I said. "Tell her you'll set something up. Buy a few days, then call me back." I called my attorney within 10 minutes. I laid out what was happening. She said she'd be ready. We set a date and a time. I gave my daughter the address of my attorney's office and told her that was where the meeting was going to happen. My daughter said, "She's not going to like that." I said, "I know." She said, "She's going to think we're being hostile." I said, "Someone who arrives at a first family financial meeting with documents already prepared is not coming in good faith. We're not being hostile. We're being equal." The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. His mother arrived with a folder. She had dressed carefully, professional, composed, the kind of outfit that says, "I'm a serious person who deserves to be taken seriously." She had a man with her, introduced as a family financial advisor. He was not a licensed attorney. My attorney noted that quietly, without making a scene. We sat down. My attorney sat beside me. My daughter and her husband sat together across from his mother and the advisor. His mother began warmly, as she always did. She talked about family, about legacy, about how important it was for everyone to be aligned when there were significant assets involved. She used the word transparency 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Each time she said it, she looked at me. Then she opened the folder. The documents were a proposal, and I use that word loosely, for a family trust structure that would pool resources across both families for a collective benefit. There were signature lines. There were blanks where numbers were meant to be filled in. It had been prepared in advance of this meeting. My daughter's husband looked at the documents and his face went still. My attorney asked if she could review the paperwork. His mother handed it over with a smile. My attorney spent about 4 minutes reading. Then she set it down and said pleasantly, "These appear to be transfer authorization documents. Is that right?" The advisor started to explain. My attorney let him finish and then said, "To be clear, these would require my client to voluntarily transfer a portion of our assets into a structure controlled by a trustee who is not her daughter, and not her daughter's husband. Is that an accurate reading?" The room was very quiet. His mother said, "It's a family structure," my attorney said. "The trustee named in this document is you." Another quiet. His mother looked at me. I looked back at her. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. My daughter's husband slowly pushed the folder back across the table. He said, and I will remember his voice in this moment for the rest of my life. He said, "Mom, what is this?" She started to explain. He listened. His face went through several things I recognized: confusion, then the particular pain of understanding, then something harder. He was quiet when she finished. Then he said, "I think we're done here." She said his name. He said, "I'm not signing anything, and neither is my wife. Not today, not after this." He looked at my daughter. My daughter looked at him. Something passed between them, some understanding, some solidifying, and she reached over and put her hand in his. His mother stood up. She was controlled, but her hands were tight on the strap of her bag. She looked at me and said, "You've turned them against me." I said, "I didn't have to turn anyone. You handed them the paperwork yourself." She left. The advisor followed her without a word. We sat in the conference room for a few minutes after. My attorney gathered her notes. My daughter's husband rubbed his face with both hands and said, "I didn't know. I want you to know that. I genuinely didn't know." I believed him. I still do. He apologized to my daughter, and then he looked at me and apologized again. I told him he didn't have anything to apologize for, that who our parents are is not who we are, and that I'd watched him this past year and I knew what kind of man he was. We walked out into the afternoon sun, and my daughter held my arm the way she used to when she was small. In the months that followed, his mother tried twice more, once through a letter sent to my daughter's home that was dressed up as a reconciliation but contained, buried in the third paragraph, a request for consideration of the family structure we discussed, and once through a phone call to my daughter's husband that lasted 40 minutes and left him exhausted and sad in a way that broke my heart a little. Both times they held. He put some distance between himself and his mother. Not a complete break, because she is still his mother, and grief is complicated, and love doesn't follow clean lines. But he made it clear to her that his wife's financial life and his wife's grandmother's financial life were not subjects she was permitted to revisit. I thought about that phone call he made to her. I thought about what it costs a person to draw a line like that with their own parent. I had more respect for him after that than I'd had before, which was already considerable. My daughter called me one evening a few weeks after everything had settled. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Did you always know, even from the beginning?" I told her the truth. I said, "I suspected early. I hoped I was wrong. But when you've been watching people for 67 years, you develop a sense for when someone is looking at you and seeing something they want to take." She was quiet. Then she said, "I'm glad you talked to me when you did. I'm glad I listened." I told her I was glad too. Then she said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. She said, "I think the hardest part wasn't being angry at her. It was watching him have to choose. And watching him choose right. That, I thought, was the clearest sign she was going to be okay." There's a thing that happens when you get older and you've seen enough of life. You stop being surprised by the bad parts. Greed is old. People attaching themselves to other people's resources under the name of family is as old as families themselves. None of that surprised me. What still surprises me in the best way, is when people choose correctly under pressure. When they look at the thing being asked of them and they say, quietly and clearly, "No." My late husband used to say that character isn't what you have when things are easy. It's what you have when someone you love is asking you to look away from something wrong. My daughter has it. Her husband, it turned out, has it too. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. I keep the trust documents in a fireproof safe in my office. They're in order, properly structured, protected in every way my attorney and I could think to protect them. My daughter knows where the key is. She knows the name of my attorney. She knows every number that matters. She knows because I told her not to make her anxious, but because knowledge is the only armor that actually works. Silence protects you from the outside, but knowledge protects you from the inside. You need both. The house I live in has been in my family for over 30 years. My late husband and I bought it when interest rates were brutal and we could barely make the payment, and we were 29 years old and terrified and certain all at once. I have walked through every room of that house, through every version of my life. I watched my daughter learn to walk in the hallway. I sat on the back porch and cried after my husband died for months, until I ran out of tears and had to figure out what came next. That house is not going anywhere. Not to a family trust with someone else's name on the trustee line. Not to anyone who looks at it and sees an asset instead of a home. Some things you protect not because they're valuable, but because they're yours. My daughter understands that now. I think she understood it before. She just needed someone to say it out loud, plainly, without apology. I'm glad I was the one who got to do that. I'm glad she listened. And if you're reading this and you have something worth protecting, a home, a savings account, a piece of land, a life you built slowly and carefully over decades, let me tell you what my mother told me, and what I told my daughter, and what I hope she'll tell her someday. The people who truly love you will never need you to sign something before they've let you read it. Anyone who does is not there for you. They're there for what they think they can get from you. Know the difference. And when you're not sure, make them wait until your attorney arrives. I've thought a lot about what happened in that conference room. Not the drama of it, the folder sliding back across the table, the silence that followed, but the quieter thing underneath it. The thing that was always there, working in the background, long before any of us sat down in those chairs. What I know after 67 years of paying attention is that actions compound. Not in a mystical sense, just in a plain, observable human sense. Winifred spent years building a version of herself that looked like warmth but functioned like strategy. Every casserole, every phone call, every "my other daughter." It was investment. She was patient. She was methodical. And for a long time, it probably worked on people who weren't watching closely enough. But that's the thing about a long pattern of behavior. It doesn't stay hidden. It surfaces eventually, in small ways first, and then in one large, undeniable way. She handed us a folder with her own name on the trustee line. She did that. No one forced her. That was the sum total of every choice she'd made, right there on the table. And Callum, I think about him too. He didn't know. I believe that completely. But here's what I've come to understand. Not knowing doesn't protect you forever. At some point, you have to look at what's in front of you and decide who you are. He looked. He pushed the folder back. That wasn't a small thing. That was a man choosing integrity over comfort, in a moment when choosing comfort would have been very easy and very understandable. That choice came from somewhere. It came from the kind of person he'd been working, quietly, to become. Nadine listened to me 3 weeks before her wedding. Not because I told her to, not because she was obligated, but because she'd spent 34 years watching me pay attention to the world, and she trusted that attention. That trust didn't come from a single conversation. It came from every honest thing I'd said to her over the course of her life, including the hard things, the things that were uncomfortable to say and uncomfortable to hear. That's what I want to pass on more than any trust document, more than any protected asset. The willingness to say the true thing, even when the moment is inconvenient. Even when the person you love is glowing and happy, and the last thing you want to do is cast a shadow. Real protection requires that kind of honesty. It requires a certain courage. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that gets recognized or applauded, but the quiet kind. The kind that sits across from someone you love and says, "I need you to hear me all the way through. The house is still mine. The trust is intact. My daughter and her husband are still married and still building something real. None of that happened by accident. It happened because at a specific moment, a specific woman chose to speak, and a specific young woman chose to listen, and a specific young man chose to look clearly at who his mother was and not look away. We earn our outcomes. Not always, and not perfectly. Life is too complicated for that kind of clean math. But more often than we admit, what we get is a reflection of what we've been building toward, slowly, over time. Winifred built toward that folder. Callum built toward pushing it back. My daughter built toward holding her husband's hand and the quiet after. And I built toward having an attorney's number already in my phone when I needed it. None of us get to skip the building part. That's the whole thing, really. That is the whole thing.